So today is June 15th, 2020. We're recording at noon because I had a meeting this morning. And by the time I got home, I just want to list this off for posterity. This is what happened Monday morning before noon. From the time that I got up this morning at 6:30 till noon. They took down the statue of George Orwell outside of BBC Broadcasting House because Orwell's themes no longer align with the BBC's values. Which you can't make that up. I had a guy text me after I posted that on Instagram. He's like, that's an Onion article, right? I'm like, nope, that's reality.
Yeah, no, they missed the irony of that one.
Then, Israel, in order to spite Palestine, acknowledged the divinity of Christ. Because someone tweeted, privilege doesn't get much whiter than making a Roman-era Palestinian like this, with a picture of Jesus. To which the official Israel Twitter page, which is fantastic in itself, that the whole nation of Israel has their own official Twitter page. God, Jesus was a Palestinian. Jesus, hey, Dad, remember when you gave that speech about Jewish values at my bar mitzvah? And then the sub-comment was, I did not have, quote, the state of Israel acknowledges the divinity of Christ to spite Palestinians on my 2020 bingo card.
No.
Then,
there's
after
more.
that, WikiLeaks dumped a huge group of files online, which I've been reading. So you have all of Hillary Clinton's emails, McCann's being guilty, the Vegas shooter being done by an FBI sniper, Steve Jobs' HIV letter / doctor's diagnosis, the Podesta files, Afghanistan, Syria, Iran, the Bilderberg Conference, the CIA agents who have been arrested for rape, and the World Health Organization pandemic plan in 2009.
Yeah.
That's WikiLeaks today. Yeah.
Fun times.
That was by noon. And there was other stuff too. That was just the highlights.
So are we spinning out of control?
I don't know if we're spinning out of control. I just think that whoever is programming the simulation had a stroke.
Terrible.
And is no longer in control.
Yeah. Well, and like we said before, I mean, for you and I, like our people, they look around and say, those people are crazy. You know,
yeah.
We have enough physical distance, more than 6 feet, you know.
And then we have the autonomous state of Chaz.
Right.
To make things, to really cap everything off.
Well, untenable, unsustainable, but I guess it'll be fun for a while. I mean, maybe they're missing Coachella or something.
Tell the tanks roll down the street.
Are they even having Burning Man this year? I don't even know.
No, they're not. They're not.
So it's like Burning Man in the middle of Seattle.
Yeah. It's crazy. It's crazy what's happening. It is a little insane for sure. And I can understand talking with folks here at my church and talking at the pastors this morning. There's a generational thing too, because the boomers amongst our colleagues, they've been through the 60s and the 70s. So they're more worried about COVID, whereas the millennials are more worried about the race riots and race wars, however you want to frame it, depending on what news station you listen to. They're more concerned about that. But to the point, then, we thought today to dive into something topical, but yet stay a little bit more on point. We're going to read an article from 1970, I believe it is, by one of our spiritual fathers, Ken Korby, pastor, professor, Ken Korby.
February 1970, Concordia Theological Monthly.
There you go. And he wrote on racism, basically. It's on the racial issue, as they called it in 1970. But something that we talked about this morning then with the pastors, I said I would like a conversation, a roundtable about this topic in our circuit. Because, like I've said to you before, I think we have an opportunity as a church right now to really make a statement. Not to exploit current events for our benefit, but also not to shut the doors and lock ourselves inside and we'll just wait till it's over. But to really preach into this in a concrete and real way, and to say, this is what the wrath of God actually looks like.
Yeah, I was going to say, we actually have the truth on our side.
Right.
And we have the opportunity to speak truth to everything else that's happening.
Right.
Which I'm not saying that there aren't many valid perspectives, right? But that's not the same as truth. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of a difficult...
Capital The truth.
Yeah, the truth, meaning Jesus. You know, that's not a real popular thing to say these days. There's a certain degree of irony that we've spent how many weeks now discussing various things on this show out loud. Yeah. And not necessarily, I mean, I think you and I have tried to be thoughtful, not just out loud and, in the show, but even before, and consider different opinions. But that idea of a moderate conversation or a moderate one. I posted. I actually did post to aggravate some people, probably, but also because I thought it was helpful because it was this sort of response from Making Sense podcast.
Yeah.
Who is that?
Sam Harris.
Sam Harris. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he says some things that aren't going to make anybody happy.
Right.
That's talking about policing and, racial injustice and whatnot. But I thought was very moderate, sensible.
Right.
Which is ironic given his kind of historic tradition, traditional viewpoint.
Right. Well, we talked about this before is I can disagree with your conclusion, but at least appreciate your logic.
Well, 99% of what he talked about, I would be like, yeah, I think that's reasonable. Sure. But then he has this like visceral reaction towards the president.
Right.
Like the president, there's nothing the president can possibly be right.
Right.
Like,
right.
You're so moderate on everything, but then you've got your blind spot too.
Yeah, there's the hole in your fence. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just like, but you're not offering a better option. Well, just vote for this other guy. Right. Yeah, I know he falls asleep and whatnot on TV, but
the person who created all your problems, vote for that person to solve your problems.
It's like, well, I guess we all have those, right? I like how you call them hole in a fence.
There, it's holes in your fence, vulnerabilities, weaknesses.
Yeah.
So moderation, not so much friendly or nice attitude of mind, but rather a joyous composure that can bear suffering and injustice with equanimity that comes from joy of the Lord. This moderation imitates the humility of Jesus on earth, for it is a moderation in joy, a living on the goodness of the Lord. It restrains the passion for vindictiveness and wills by patient practice to live in good toward both enemy and friend. Such moderation will not, on the basis of legal rights, push itself to moral wrong. Just because it's legally right doesn't make it morally good.
Think about Jesus. I mean, did he have every right to defend himself as he was put on trial?
Sure.
Did he?
Well, why didn't he just end slavery? I mean,
sure.
Wasted opportunity. Just saying. Right. But I mean, you can bring up that argument because it's been brought up in relation to other political topics. Well, why didn't Jesus say this about this, or why didn't he do this if he was really God? You can say the same thing about slavery. Why does Paul perpetuate slavery in Philemon? He's like, well, yeah, but he wanted to. No, listen,
it's a different kind of slavery, but
yeah, right, exactly. What I'm saying though, like that's your excuse. You can equivocate, like, yeah, but he's pushing for a different kind of
who do you want to be slave to? The banks or towards the person who you actually owe money to? Right. I could see the advantage of actually indenturing myself to the one I owe money to rather than
100%
some kind of bank.
Right.
At least they might actually treat me like as a human being, like the financial institutions.
As an unbeliever, and we were talking earlier about being experts because you're on social media. The number of friends of mine who are not believers who have become biblical exegetes and theological scholars in the last month, lecturing to me on what the Bible says about love and race. Yeah. I'm just like, dude. Like,
well, I mean, you're looking for some kind of authority,
right?
Because the authorities have really, some of them dropped the ball on this one.
Well, I always laugh and I'm like, hey, have you read the book of Judges?
Nobody reads the book of Judges.
I know, right? Judges and Joshua. That's my
go-to. Listen to the 40 minutes in the Old Testament. Listen to the last, I don't know, it was last month when they got to the end of the book. And it's like,
it's rough.
Yeah, this is horrific.
Even for people who have read Judges, because we bring that up all the time now in reference, because when we got to the end of Judges, those last 4-6 chapters, like, again, people that have grown up in the church their whole life, when we read those last couple chapters about the prophet and the concubine and stuff, and the war, they're like, I did not know this existed in the Bible. I'm like, this is rough. This is really
priests
rough.
For hire. Yeah.
Priests for hire who, again, let their concubine be raped all night long and then just use that and go, hey, get up, get dressed, we're leaving. He literally says that to her.
I know.
And then uses that as a pretext to start a civil war so he can get a better job the next village over. Like, that is rough. And then that's in the Bible.
Yeah, what's it even doing in there is when you start to ask the question, well, because
there's something there.
You can always say, I guess you could say then it could always be worse.
It could always be worse. But, and to Korby's point too, I try and bring this up pastorally is if we read the Gospel of John, for example, and Jesus talking about love, especially in the farewell discourse, great. But I prefer then to put that in the context of Judges, for example.
Right.
because we still have to raise this question of the law and vocation. And I know we want to be slappy, clappy, emotional over here about love, and let's just love everybody and get along. But Judges, in my opinion, Judges is a much more honest depiction of the world and what happens when power goes unchecked, relationships when we become overtly tribal, even though we're from the same family, essentially.
Right. The judgment against sin, death, the devil, against this world is one of the ways that God in Christ manifests his love.
Right.
Is that this isn't forever.
Right.
Can you imagine? I mean, that would be like going back to the garden, except you're sinners and you're dying forever. Yeah.
That'd be fantastic. I think God deals with that, something about living forever.
Yeah, right.
It'd be horrific.
I thought that was Highlander.
Right. That's when Eve kills Adam and says there can be only one.
Yeah, and then Queen kicks in.
That's right. Here we are. See, now it's there. Now I'm going to... Okay. We derailed at 1 hour. At 1 hour 38.
I've been working on it. I finally found something to get you.
There we go. So imitate the humility of Christ, essentially, is what Korby's driving at, which is ironic for a Lutheran to basically go back to that.
But not for salvation. Right?
No.
I mean, that's his point. Just keep it where it belongs.
There we go. Exactly.
Love for neighbor. Yeah.
So these are good. Live in good towards both your enemy and your friends. Such moderation will not, on the basis of legal rights, push itself to moral wrongs. Again, just because you have the high ground doesn't mean you should start a fight.
Right.
If Anakin wants to charge uphill like a moron and get his arms and legs chopped off, that's his fault. Just saying. That's his fault.
I can't believe you quoted a prequel.
I did it just because I know Brown.
I can't even remember that movie.
I was scarred by it, and therefore it's burned into my memory.
Ingrained in your memory. There was a lot of fire.
A lot of fire. A lot of choreographed prancing around lightsaber duels there. Ugh. Such moderation is born only of that life that is hidden in the gracious will of God and faith. If in the hostility and threats of men a man sees nothing but God's wrath with no hope, then most surely he will respond with wrath, hostility, and threats. There we go.
Violence begets violence.
What's happening with the riots? God's wrath is coming up off the streets. There's no gospel. Therefore, hate begets hate. Violence begets violence. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No hope. Christians who are anxious about their life, especially in the face of such threats, are invited by the Apostle Paul to combat such cares with, quote, prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, making the requests known to God. Philippians chapter 4. Such fasting, such abstinence from wrathful responses, such control of passions that perpetrate evil, and such joyful sufferings help reveal Christian moderations to all men. Instead of man's being the sentinel over his own rights, the peace of God will stand guard over him to keep him in peace. Which is exactly what I was thinking when I walked out of the butcher shop last Thursday, rather than get into a fight with somebody.
Yeah.
As being a good Christian. I wasn't wearing my ribbon.
We were studying Sermon on the Mount. We're kind of going through it in our morning Bible class each day. And the when Jesus comes to murder, to anger, and loving your enemies, he quotes Moses. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And Moses says it all over the place. It's in Leviticus, it's in Deuteronomy, it's in Exodus, in various ways. And that is the human response to violence, right? You did this to me, I'm going to equally, reciprocally, or even maybe greater, give you what you deserve as that. And then you read like the psalmist, and David's much more cautious, right? He wants to be wrathful. He is angry. He hates his enemy, and yet he gives it over to God over and over, right? Says, they're your enemy now, right? You take vengeance on them. Vengeance is yours, not mine, right? And I think that you could apply that when it comes to racial injustice and whatnot. I mean, it is unjust. There's no doubt about it. It's unjust, right? And it's God's problem.
Yeah.
Right. And because it's our hearts, but he made us.
That literally is the problem, though. That literally is the problem for us old Adams is it's God's problem. When I would much rather make it my problem in God's name, because I mean, to kind of go off on a cape and riff, God forbid if my enemy gets absolved and converted by God.
It has to sit in
and then I got to sit next to them in church on Sunday.
Ouch.
I want to twist your head off.
Yeah.
Why you can't commune with me?
Yeah.
I see that. You see that in the Old Testament in particular. You see that with liberation theology, like we've been talking about. It's just human nature to say, Yes, yes, yes. I know God, they all have to answer to God in the end, but we all want that satisfaction of knowing that they're going to get theirs.
Right.
Because ultimately, too, it's essentially confessing you don't believe in the resurrection and the life everlasting.
Well, that's what I was going to say, and that's why I love, Capon, or not Capon. We were talking Capon. This is Korby's response, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's to say, no, you can't respond that way because it's not given to you to be that way.
Right.
You're given to abstain from wrathful responses because that's the Lord's. That's His job.
Right.
Right. To control your passions because that's the Spirit's work in you. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And to suffer. Even if it means, your friends are going to look at you and say, how dare you, march alongside those folks.
Right.
Well,
to bring it back around to something controversial then, Miyamoto Musashi, he's a famous Japanese swordsman and Ronin actually, but anyways, he's famous. There's a great biography of him out there. He said that the approach to combat in everyday life should be the same. And I bring that up as a point of reference because to be meek, literally translated, as we've learned from our friend Jordan Peterson, to be meek literally means to know how to use a sword, but you choose to keep it sheathed. Mm-hmm. This is actually Peter's sin in the Garden of Gethsemane, is he unsheaths his sword. He is not meek anymore. He chooses to chop off the servant's ear. Literally, the bookend to Jesus' teaching on meekness is Peter in the Garden of Gethsemane. So to our point then, Peter, I got a sword. I got a sword. I might as well use it. Every people with hammer see nail. He's got a sword. Jesus is being attacked. Let's chop this. I mean, the most impetuous of the disciples, the one with no impulse control, is just like, yeah, I'll do it. And shout out to Peter for actually living up to his word. I'll die rather than let you die. And he goes for it. He goes hard in the paint on that one. But Jesus is like, yeah, blessed are you if you know how to use your sword, but keep it sheathed. So it's not be a pushover. It's not be a wallflower. Don't be passive. Don't let people walk all over you. But yet there's also that aspect of, like Martin Luther King constantly hammering on, love is the most powerful force in the universe. It is the only force for actual good in the universe, for actual change, reform, is love. You have to love each other. You have to love your enemy if you want to see actual change. Actual reform.
That's being self-sacrificial for their sake. Right.
You have to sacrifice yourself. And that in a secular sense, the blood of the martyrs cry up to heaven and they will elicit a response. But also in a sense of actual martyrdom, actual Christians marching down the street saying, go ahead, shoot me. Shoot me. I'll die for the sake of love. I'll sacrifice myself for those who are to come after me. And
I mean, like real, well, I wouldn't say real, but a stronger cause to rally around where someone had both hands up in the air, made no move, and were shot. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That really, I can rally behind, like, that's unjust.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Exactly. But it to my point then, it's not don't see, this is the again, the dichotomy for me is loving your neighbor means protecting your neighbor's body and life.
Yeah, it's both.
At any cost, while simultaneously saying, I love you so much, I'll kill for you to preserve your life, but I love you so much, I'll die for you to preserve your life.
Well, ironically, you can't kill for them if you're dead. So it makes it a little challenging.
Right. And this goes back to the point of, well, what if God sends you to be the messenger of violence? Like you're the judge. Like you need to protect your neighbor's life. And to use a practical example, then, as if any parent would tell you, there's no way I'm going to just roll over and ignore my child when they're being attacked by a dog or a human being or another child. Like, I'm not going to just sit there passively and be like, oh, well, God will take care of this.
Well, that's the kind of thing that happens.
Right. Versus, well, no, your actual vocation given to you by God is to get up and actually stop that from happening. But that's not in and of itself somehow going to get you points. Like, God's not going to be like, point. Yeah.
No. And like we were talking about earlier, I mean, you can't do it in a purely reasonable, rational, moderate kind of way. Right. Because you're going to, this is flesh your flesh, right? So you are going to have some emotion. Right. Because we're emotional creatures. And actually, we were given emotions to worship God with all of ourself, all of our senses. And that also is then a byproduct of original sin, is that we allow our emotions Right.
to come out this way rather than, I'm going to worship God with all of myself. I'm actually going to place the life of this person or this thing above worship of God. Or what if I do it in faith? Is that then worship of God? Dr. Luther famously said, whatever when you go to your work in faith, you're worshiping God. Is that true of a soldier? Is that true of a police officer, a SWAT team? Is that true of? So I'd say yes.
Yeah, but I would also feel compelled. I mean, I'd have to pray all the time.
Of course.
In that vocation.
Go back and read on whether a Christian can be a soldier or a soldier can be a Christian by Dr. Luther. And if it's done in faith, he's actually got nothing to confess.
Isn't it something like, can a soldier to be saved?
Yes, that's it. Yeah. Yeah, depending on the translation.
Yeah.
So, and I only bring this up by way of example at the end because this isn't cut and dried. It's not binary. It's not simple, or it is simple. It's just not easy.
And as soon as you make a law out of it, now you've confused things again. Where you say, well, Christians have to, march, for example.
Right.
No, they don't necessarily. They might have that calling in their community. Because,
well, again, just because it's right doesn't, it might be socially or civilly or community right, but it doesn't mean it's morally right. And it definitely doesn't mean it's Christian.
Right. But what would be morally evil is if you see your brother in need and you stand by and say, well,
I'll pray for you.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
No.
Again, my house is on fire right now. I don't need you to pray for me. I need you to help me put the fire out.
Yeah. Or do you hear that guy saying, I can't breathe, right?
Right. There's a time for prayer and there's a time for action. Now, we're called to wait on the Lord for him to distinguish for us, determine for us which is going to happen. Morning prayer, for example, on Sunday mornings. That's a time when we say, okay, for the next hour, we will be engaged in prayer and praise. We set that aside. That's what we're going to do. But then you go back into your vocation. Now you can pray in your vocations or not.
Right.
You can act in your vocations or not. But ultimately, you don't get to determine for yourself how that spins out.
Nope.
Because you're a sinner. So I know I was thinking about this when we were reading this. So I have 3 Instagram accounts, one for the Warrior Priest podcast, one for my author page for this stuff and the 1517 Christ Hold Fast work, and then my own personal page, which is basically just me being sarcastic and posting mixed martial arts stuff and pictures of my kids. So I can get away with being theological on one page, being stoic on another page, and being snarky and sarcastic on a third page, which is not only hypocritical, it's like tri-hypocritical. It's like threefold hypocritical.
Yeah, no.
Because I am curating my social media profiles in such a way that I can say, well, over here I'm this guy, but over here I'm that guy.
Well, none of them are purely representative.
Of course not. But that's what we do. And I'm just using it as a more explicit point. I can do that. And then I can kind of compartmentalize my social output and say, well, over here, sarcasm, but over here, they wouldn't appreciate this. So I'll post a Bible.
Can you imagine how two-dimensional people really were if their social media accounts actually represented the whole person?
Right. It's just, every day is a picture of your
like
cat.
Cartoon characters almost.
Yeah. But that's this to the point then that we're constantly bombarded and we're indoctrinated with messages that push us one way or the other way, pull us one way or the other way. And that message may actually come clothed in Christianity or Christianese and seem on the surface to be perfectly, like we talked about. If you're poor and you're struggling and you're oppressed, liberation theology is going to appeal to you. You probably will then not take the next step and ask, why is this Marxist ideology in my liberation theology?
Yeah, I was going to say it'll appeal to you for a while until the bottom falls out of it.
Well, or as I saw, when those who are oppressed revolt and become the oppressors.
Yeah.
Because they become the avenger. And now all of a sudden you have to tweak your theology because you're the person that you hate.
It's just like how, this is a autonomous zone, and but yet you have police people patrolling. I thought you wanted to get rid of the police
and a wall and security checkpoints.
Yeah, I know. So anarchy leads to
and a racially segregated garden.
Saw that.
That's fantastic.
It's like just failing to see all the levels of irony.
For those of you who live in Seattle, I know it's not funny, but for me personally, this is the best thing that could happen to America right now, because that's a microcosm of what the entire country would look like if that were allowed to just run wild, unchecked.
Yeah, I mean, you don't even need Carrie Brownstein or whatever making a show.
Right. No, that is 100%. If it wasn't for the sexual assaults and beatings and thievery and everything else, it's a Portlandia episode. If Portlandia made a movie, that's it.
Yeah. Loss of property.
27 different fish cover pans. Yeah. I laugh because it's so absurd. It's not funny and like, ha ha. It's funny absurd. Like, I can't believe we're here.
Well, but I think there will be, I hope that there will be some reasonableness that comes out of it. People will look at it and say, okay, all right, that's too far.
Well, go back and look at the occupation of Alcatraz in the 60s by the Native Americans, for example.
I don't even know
took Alcatraz. Yeah, they took Alcatraz. They occupied it for a while, like a month maybe even longer. And in the end, the government went in and gassed them and drove them out and stuff like that, and they were arrested, and there was bad stuff that happened. But go back and look at, because there is a point of reference for us in history for these things. Like we were talking about before we hit record, racism is essentially invented by the Enlightenment. Racism as we know it today. Because German anthropologists and French Enlightenment philosophers basically had to figure out a way to justify slavery. And so the myth of the subhuman man, the black man's subhuman. Therefore, we're not really selling people, and therefore they can't really be Christian or God's creatures.
We are self-justifying people.
Oh, we're so good at it. So good. That's why social media is so popular. We can be whoever we want to be day to day.
We can prove it.
And we can prove it, exactly. But there's always a point of reference, and whether you agree or disagree, go do your homework. This is the thing, and I'm going to be the grumpy old man for a second. Talking with friends who are millennials, I am just stunned by how little you people read. Like, read history. Read lots of history. Like, I've been talking with people, I'm like, oh, they'll say something like, where'd you get that from? Like, Frederick Douglass? I'm like, who? I'm like, oh, really? Really? Like, you don't know who Frederick Douglass is?
Well,
what?
And even if they do, it's like you're not going to learn from other people's mistakes because you have the, what do you want to say? Not pride, the arrogance to think that you can do better.
Sure. That too, for sure.
We can do better than Marx and Lenin, I'm sure. Well, actually, they were really successful for a while.
Right. We'll do it this time. But go read the Marx Engels Reader. Go get it off. Read the Marx Engels Reader. You're going to find out a lot in the reading of it, whether you agree or disagree. Go read that stuff. Go read your history. Go read the Bicycle Diaries of Che Guevara and stop wearing his T-shirts.
Well, you'll see why it's so appealing too.
You will, because it was appealing to me in my 20s.
Yeah.
I get it. I was there. But I'm, again, grumpy old man. It's just like, read your history, know your history, like the Alcatraz takeover. Go read about that and ask yourself, okay, or go read about Occupy Wall Street, by the way. Go read Occupy Wall Street. That's our generation.
I know. It's very similar. Very similar.
Very similar. And now that we're far enough away from it, we know how they twisted the narrative within Occupy Wall Street to cover up the sexual assaults and the thievery and the beatings and all the really horrible stuff.
Well, they weren't even on the right street. It wasn't supposed to be Wall Street. They weren't even on the right street. Exactly. It ended up being Wall Street, and it was supposed to be the White House.
And the agent provocateurs that the government sent in there to actually stir up rioting so they could go in there and arrest them. Like, that's all been proven now. Like, there's a lot that happened there. Independent media kind of exploded out of that event. There are a lot of independent media that came from that. So a lot of things came out of Occupy Wall Street, but when you talk with folks today, they don't really know about Occupy Wall Street. But again, that's my fault.
That wasn't that long ago.
But we don't talk about it. Unless you watch Rage Against the Machine videos, you're probably not aware.
I suppose.
Or like the International Bank and the World Monetary Fund met in Minneapolis, St. Paul when I was in college.
I remember that.
There was rioting, and it was terrible. And agent provocateurs were sent in, and Alex Jones, of all people, proved it. And these government agents were breaking windows. They were throwing garbage cans at police. They were throwing rocks at police and stuff like that to start, so the police could then come in and arrest all these people and clear all these protesters. That happened in the 90s. What happened? Why isn't that taught? Right? Like, I was taught Frederick Douglass in school. I was taught MLK in school. I was taught Malcolm X in school, and Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver. Like, I was taught all these people that I learned in elementary school. Like I said, it was a different time, obviously. So I am the grumpy old man now. I get that. But it's just, to me, it's remarkable that that is one of those components that's been slowly and systematically taken away from younger people is exposure to, like I was talking with my friend last night, my high school librarian was a Green Beret in Vietnam, just this little dude. Like if you looked at him as a high schooler, you're like, if there's anybody in the school that I could take in a fight, it's this guy. He was like 5'4", 5'5", like 145 pounds. He was but he was a Green Beret. Once you find that out, you're like, oh, Mr. Dreschler's a badass. But every time he liked me. So every time I would come to the library, he would hand me a book and say, you need to read this book. So that's how I learned about Eugene V. Debs, who, if you're not familiar, ran for president as a communist, was jailed, and then got 1 million votes while he was in jail. It's important that you go back. I was talking with my friend about this then yesterday. Go back and study socialism, communism, and anarchism and Nazism in the 20s and 30s in the United States. If you think today is crazy, go back and look at what was happening after the First World War up until the Second World War in the United States.
Even somebody like Charles Lindbergh, right?
Yeah, right. Like it was a political free-for-all during the 20s and 30s. You had anarchists running for Congress. You had Bolsheviks taking over Hollywood. You had socialists and Nazis. And you like the largest Nazi rallies in the world at that time were in the United States. And they filled Madison Square Garden. And there was rioting, and there was looting, and there was protest. The unions, by the way, like all the Scandinavian immigrants really pushed hard for those unions at those times, and the mining towns and the logging towns and so forth. Like you saw like Scandinavian forms of socialism coming out in those unions, which changed after the Second World War, obviously. But like the 20s and 30s were a really volatile time in America. And again, I was thinking about this in relation to the movie 1917, that we don't really pay attention to World War I, and yet it was so horrific because it was a modern war that they had to catch up to. Like it started off as a very pre-modern kind of type of warfare, and then within a year or 2 years, it became a modern war, and that's why it was so devastating. And today, then, because we haven't been through that stuff, what's happening today seems traumatic.
Yeah.
So then as Christians, what do we do? Well, we read Herman Sasse, who served in the trenches in World War I. And yet, look how he came out of that. He didn't come out a social reformer or a moral reformer. He didn't say, well, in order to save Europe from this plague that's descended upon us and God's wrath that's come out upon us, we've got to do, well, then Hitler comes.
Yeah, right.
And he's a German, Sasse. So he's a German during Hitler's reign. And it's interesting as a point then, does Sasse really talk that much about the Jews? I don't really remember him talking a lot about the Jews.
No, I don't either.
Like he doesn't address it very often, does he? If at all. And I bring it up as a point of comparison then that whether he was aware or not, and I'm guessing you had to be somewhat aware because he himself was under constant threat of arrest and banishment. That wasn't his focus as a university professor and as a preacher. And again, I'll knock him for that.
Yeah, and also the propaganda machine was pretty good at
yes, 100%.
Well,
yeah.
And you didn't have WikiLeaks, that's telling you what's really happening.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, and that happened today. Oof, that was WikiLeaks. Yeah, you didn't have that. And therefore, with Goebbels and the propaganda playbook that we still use to this day, it was easy to cover that stuff up and hide it.
Yeah.
And yet, the response of the Christian church at that time was some Christians took Hitler's side, either because they thought he was right or because they just self-preservation. Mm-hmm. And there were others who didn't, like Bonhoeffer and Sasse and Hans Ewand and others who ended up in jail or hung.
Or they didn't think there was maybe even a theological necessity to respond.
Right. Like there were a lot of people on the Erlangen faculty where Sasse taught who they were brown shirts so they could keep their jobs.
Mm-hmm. But it was it was politically expedient.
Right. Or the woman that I took care of in the nursing home who became a member of the Hitler Youth, so they got extra food vouchers. Like that's just how they survived. She didn't believe in the cause. She didn't even know what the cause was. She just was hungry. She was just hungry.
But you made the important point there. I mean, the news station, right? Yeah. Who has most incentive? Well, many people have incentive for it to be kind of chaotic, disorderly, things being out of control, or at least perceived that way, because that's news cycle stuff, right?
It generates revenue, and I don't know, I've talked about this before, maybe here, but anyways, I preached on it again yesterday, is 6 corporations own 90% of everything that you read, watch, and listen to every day.
6.
Viacom, Time Warner, CBS, Disney, News Corp, and General Electric.
Well, and Time Warner, is that owned by AT&T?
I think so. Yeah, AT&T, Time Warner. Yeah.
Yeah.
Excuse me. So you have General Electric, News Corp, Disney, Viacom, AT&T, Time Warner, and CBS. They own 90%. Which, to give you a point of comparison, in 1983, there were 50 companies that owned everything that you read and saw and listened to. So there were 50 media companies in 1983-ish. And then after 1991-92, Bill Clinton did some stuff. Yeah. And as a consequence, eventually 6 corporations own 90% of all the media.
Well, so it's we had the death of the local or regional newspaper.
Right. Yeah.
All right. So those all got bought up by Gannett and whoever owns them.
Yeah.
But now we actually have kind of the opposite thing, because anybody can have a YouTube channel or a blog or a Facebook thing.
Right. And we were talking about that before we went on air. I posted on my Instagram yesterday, I think, and this is actually featured at the beginning of the documentary Out of Shadows, that when you turn on, if you take all the local news stations and put them side by side in a giant window, you can actually sync up every news station because they all say the exact same thing. Literally. Not even like metaphorically. They are all saying the exact same thing.
It's not even just talking points. It's actually scripted.
No. Yeah, it's scripted. And so to your point, then building off of that, you have independent news and independent media on YouTube, podcasting. But as we were talking about then, so many people that I know that I consider intelligent, thoughtful people have chosen a side: Republican, Democrat, white, black, pro-police, anti-police, pro-Chaz, anti-Chaz, pro-Antifa,
big government, no government.
Yeah, big government, local. And what you end up seeing then is that they're repeating the talking points of the corporations and what they decide the politicians are going to talk about.
And even libertarian can have a set of talking points attached to it.
Well, apparently it does, because I have friends who are libertarians and they're all talking about the same thing today.
Mm-hmm. They listen to the same people.
They listen to the same people, and they're friends on social media, so they repost each other's memes. I do it.
Yeah. Well, I just try to aggravate people a little bit by posting people just occasionally on social, reposting someone who's outside the what I know is the typical, Lutheran conservative thought world,
right.
Who maybe has something helpful to say, and then just say, there's caveats, but, but listen to them or read it, be critical. We try to
read both sides.
We try to do that here on the show. We don't do it as much as probably we could, as far as reading things that we don't agree with.
Right.
It generally just makes us aggravated. so I'm sympathetic.
I think to that point too, because I was talking about this yesterday. We had a kind of impromptu ad hoc council meeting after church yesterday. Everything that we did up until March was primarily a matter of convenience, as far as the business of the church, scheduling meetings, how you organized Sunday school, confirmation, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
That was all a matter of convenience, because I could say Friday at 7 p.m. I could say Palm Sunday. You could count on it in a loose sort of way. But now I've had to adapt to where my congregation is at or not, and adapt to what's happening day to day, week to week in our state. And so, and the adaptation, then I've had to say to my people, then listen, that was convenient to do it that way. We don't have that anymore, because I've got people that are afraid. They're just afraid.
Yeah.
And they don't want to come back to church for that. But at the core of all of it is fear.
Well, and also, I mean, just on a very simple way, the schedule got disrupted.
Right. Yeah.
The order of operations, that we kind of, I don't know if we put our trust in them, but we certainly, relied upon them just to give us some order and some direction.
Right.
They've fallen apart.
Yeah. And that was one of the things I came in here saying, was that what was lacking before I got here. I was the 6th pastor in 8 years at this congregation when I got here 12 years ago. Consistency was the big thing. Like I was going to establish a consistency in the congregation and the polity, so that when people came to church, they knew what to expect on Sunday, from top to bottom, all the way across. And then you spend 10 to 12 years establishing that kind of consistency, and you can count on what's going to happen. And we've talked about this before numerous times, that the catechetical aspect of knowing on Sunday, this is the liturgy, and we're going to have the Lord's Supper, and we're going to have Sunday school, and we're going to have adult Bible study, and the curriculum that we wrote at this church contributes to each of these areas, so that we're all kind of traveling the same path, so that by the time we come together as a church in worship, we've read our Bible, we've studied our Bible, we've been catechized, we've had a conversation, and now we're going to come together to worship.
Right.
And it's especially for kids, I believe, it's important to establish that consistency for them, especially just the consistency of the gospel.
Well, and the reason why, you and I use liturgy is that those repeated words set that framework.
Right.
So that even though the sermon is going to be, unique to each day and the readings and the hymnody even, there is enough of a consistency. Especially families with children. I've been sensitive to that. They know. And also, I'd say being relatively consistent even on how long the service is helpful. It is helpful. And is it necessary? No. But you and I both know this. If sermon's running long, you'll find out.
Right. Yeah, the babies will be
They'll let you know.
The canary in the coal mine for sure.
It's time to move on, guys.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, people ask me that too. They're like, hey, you preach short sermons, 10.5 minutes. Like what, like, how did you get to that point? And I'm like, well, actually, it was the babies. It was. Right. It was the little kids in church. Because as we both were taught at seminary, any sermon under 25 minutes, you're not doing your job. And then you become a pastor and realize, well, actually, if your piety is sacramental, the sermon is about at most the third most important part of the divine service.
I don't play that game. Everything's important, but
no, it's not.
If everything's important, nothing's important, I suppose.
Well, I was going to say, Leah called it the imperfect word of God, the sermon, because it's mixed with human words, whereas the words of institution are perfect because they're Jesus' own words.
Let those be the main thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. Let baptism and the Lord's Supper be the thing, and then let the sermon be the thing that clears away the flotsam and jetsam. And so to that point then, though, because the media is working overtime as activists for or against the rioting and the protesting and stuff like that. And we've got governors across the board saying stay inside and don't open your businesses because of COVID, and then saying go out and protest. You can protest if you're going to go outside, but you can't go outside to open your businesses, for example, which that's where we've arrived, in my opinion, is they're so blatantly...
It just wasn't a thoughtful response based on the data anymore. Or it isn't anymore. Well, maybe it was at the very beginning. If
it was a mayor or a governor, I understand. It was thoughtless. But then to see other mayors and governors repeat it from New York all the way to Los Angeles and in between, that's just ludicrous. It's just ludicrous.
Yeah.
And so the point, though, and Dave Chappelle dropped a 30-minute set the other day called
846.
846. And as usual, you either watch it and go, thank you, that was great, or I hate you, this is terrible, you're just XYZ reasons.
I was kind of in between, actually, but that's okay.
Yeah, no, I had to watch it twice. And I think of his specials, for example, on Rotten Tomatoes, they got a 0%, but they got from the reviewers, but then the people who watched it gave it a 98%.
Well, he's not quite absurdist, but he's, it's not a tight set. He has that whole... kind of casual delivery and lots of long pauses. And you wonder how much
he's a master of his craft.
What else did he say? Because that was obviously tightly edited,
right,
to be focused on the George Floyd stuff. Yeah,
and so the first time I watched it, this is just my take on it. Like you said, is if I was more intelligent and better at expressing my thoughts, I would want to speak like him. That's the first thing, just in the way that he speaks. I appreciate him as a public speaker. I appreciate how he delivers the message he wants to get across.
Sincerity, passion. Yeah.
Right. And the first time I watched it, I wept. I just wept because, like I said, it was very intense and you could tell it was emotional for him. And there's all these coincidences with the numbers and so forth.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say with his personal anecdote.
Yeah.
And what was the time of his birth, right?
Right, 846. And then his great-grandfather marched to the state capitol in, I think, South Carolina, wherever it was.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of history there for him. And if you go back and watch Killing Me Softly and even his earliest specials, he talks about this stuff back then. And then I posted Richard Pryor stuff from 74 and 78. And he was talking about it in 74 and 78. So I think part of it is just we don't care to remember our own history. Even in the sense of, comics have been talking about this. Black comics have been talking about this for 50 years, 60 years, longer. But we've only been recording it for the past 50 or 60. And so agree or disagree, and I have plenty of people who disagree with his set, and I've listened to them too, like you pointed out. I listened to both sides. I went back and listened to it a second time then, not objectively, and came away with basically the same opinion. It's like most of what he said I agree with when it's coming from him, and the way he articulates it, I agree. And unfortunately, I think that especially in the last week, as the narrative has been pushed so hard in either direction by the media that it's almost impossible for anybody to just say, yeah, I agree with 80% or 70% of what he says, but these other points over here I disagree with.
Yeah, it's hard to find clarity, especially with that binary kind of, you're either all in or you're out.
Yeah.
We talked about that in the last episode. Yeah.
Well, and this is, Jocko Willing talks about this in relation to discipline and work, which is it emotion or is it logic? And his point is, it's logic until you can't push, you just run out of, like, you can't push yourself any further, and then you go to emotion.
Am I going to exercise? Do I need to exercise? Yes.
Right. Yes.
But then when you're in the middle of it and it's hard,
that's when you switch over to rage or anger or that whatever you need to do to get that last mile or lift that last
to do what you
set.
know is right and good.
Yeah. Right.
But you don't feel it.
So for him, it's both, and it's just understanding the dichotomy of, like, when to employ discipline and logic and rationality, and when do you employ feelings and that kind of, and emotion. And I bring that up because I have friends, they're all just emotional, emoting, feeling, and you people are uncaring and you're racist because all you care about are these facts, etc. But then the other side, all they want to do is argue facts.
Yeah.
And they say your feelings, facts don't care about your feelings. And so with the polarization, though, on both sides, they just go deeper and deeper into more and more facts and
Entrenched.
more strongly emotive statements. Yeah, they become entrenched. And I'm sitting here saying, we can benefit from both sides. Right. Like, you people need to listen to the facts and stop crying and screaming in people's faces. And you need to empathize with something that's never happened to you before and understand their house is on fire. And yes, all houses are important to their owners. But right now, this house is on fire and we need to address this. We need to put this fire out.
Well, I was thinking about this in regards to the police. And people have said, well, they just need better training. I'm like, okay, that's probably true. I mean, they're not trained. We talked about that, not being trained well in hand-to-hand and defensive arts and that kind of thing, restraint, and doing it, in a safe way. Apparently, somebody wants to ban chokeholds entirely, which
some cities have, I thought.
Is that true? Okay.
Yeah, some areas have banned chokeholds.
The problem is that a police officer, you're not a purely logical person.
Right.
You can't just respond instinctually to every event. Sometimes you are going to respond emotionally, and of course that's where maybe things can go wrong. But the same as, I was watching one of these, it was in the Atlanta thing at the Wendy's.
Yeah.
I was watching that, and a lot of comments is like, no, just put up your hands and then just take it to court. But in the moment, emotionally, given everything that's going on, and you're a black man and there's white cops, right? I mean,
and you've been drinking.
So
allegedly.
you're not in the right state of mind, whatever is going on. You can't just be rational in that moment. You're not going to be purely rational in that moment and say, I'm going to put my hands up. I'll just take him to court. It'll be an unjust, arrest, and, I'll get reparations and it'll be fine. Well,
to cite an anecdote, the way that where I grew up at and the side of the street that I grew up on, and the cops that I grew up with were small town bullies. They just were. They would run stop signs. They would run their lights to drive through red lights. Like, they would just flash their cherries to drive through red lights. They didn't care. And they would shoot the kegs at the parties. If there was a keg party, they busted. They just shoot the keg, and they would just punch kids. They put them up against the wall and just punch them a couple times.
Yeah, that's terrible.
That kind of stuff. And they were just bullies. They're just bullies.
It's not Sheriff Andy, right?
No. And so the way that I grew up then was, not only do you grow up hating the police because they're abusive and corrupt, but you're always afraid of them. You're always afraid of them.
Yeah.
You always avoid them. So even to this day then, even though as a pastor I have relationships with the police in my area, if I'm pulled over without my collar on, which I can't remember the last time I was actually pulled over, but every time I go by a cop like I did this morning, I get emotional. Because you get that anxiety, you get that anxiousness of, like,
look in your rear view, watch for the flashers.
Yeah, it's ingrained in me. And I know it's not rational.
Whether you were breaking a law or not, yeah.
Yeah, I know it's not rational. I'm not breaking the law. I'm an adult. I have an actual career. I have a respectable position in the community, at least in my community. Being a pastor is still considered respectable. And so I don't have anything to be afraid of. But yet that childhood emotion kind of comes back up and says, but maybe he's the one. Maybe this is the day. Which Chappelle brings up on his set about the cop that pulled him over and the next day shot that guy. But And then I know, again, friends of mine who are police, it's the same thing because they've said to me, if you don't think that we don't hear what's said about us in the media or what things are said online, or just the fact that we get emails and texts and private messages from people. And if you don't think that doesn't affect us when it's 11:30 on a Friday night and we're pulling somebody over and it's a dark and rainy night, and you don't think that we're trying to control our emotions too, because we're walking up to a window of a car, we can't see into it, we don't know what's going on, it's driving erratically, so this could just be a drunk driver on his way home from the bar, or this could be something else.
It's life and death stuff for them too.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And basically the direction that the media has chosen to go with the narrative of the police, like I said to you last week, this doesn't end well for anybody.
Mm-mm.
You don't want police officers feeling besieged from both the civilian population and the media and the bureaucrats.
Can you imagine, like, if you disarm the cops, but you still allow Second Amendment gun ownership?
No, that'd be like where I live at. Everybody here's got 3 guns minimum.
Yeah.
And we're 40 miles from Minneapolis. That's how wild it is to live. I'm 40-minute drive from downtown Minneapolis, and yet everybody in my area is a Trump supporter for the most part.
Well, and I wonder, I just try to stay in my lane. And I think that's part of what's going on is that everybody's a critic. Everybody's commentary matters, and especially with social media. You think about, like we talked about with the COVID response, when you would have journalists interviewing other journalists. Yeah. You're like,
they are the story.
Wait a minute. Well, like, why don't you have somebody who has, clinical experience with, communicable disease or pandemic response or somebody who actually has some wisdom.
Right. No.
But instead it feeds on itself.
I was joking with my friend about that over the weekend. He's a chemist. And I said, John, I understand you have a master's degree in chemistry and you do something in a lab somewhere for some big company. But I have a social media account. And so I just wanted to say to you about COVID. Well, I sent you that Ryan Long video. Shout out to comedian Ryan Long about how he takes a piece of film and he edits it in such a way that he can sell half of it to CNN and the other half to Fox News.
Right.
It's fantastic. We'll post a link to it. But that's the problem that we have is that we can watch, like, the news will take a piece of video, chop it up and edit it to make their point.
Right.
And then the other station will take the exact same video and chop it up and edit it to prove their point. And that's what I thought Ryan, it's like JP Sears with spiritual life. Like
very much like that.
He's so good at satirizing that genre of self-help spirituality.
But I think it's okay to step back and just say, I don't have an opinion. I don't even know what to make of this. I wasn't there. I look at the video.
Or at least just to say, this is my opinion. This isn't the truth. This is my opinion.
Well, that's true too. Right. And say, from what I see, this is what I see in this, right? Yeah. And am I right or wrong? I don't know. What's the jury gonna say? We don't know. We don't know.
Right. Well, and I said this in my sermon yesterday, is some people will argue, well, I'm in favor of the Democratic Party, and others will say, well, I'm in favor of the Republican Party. And I just made the point, you're not rich enough to get invited to the party. Like
$1,000 plate. Yeah.
And as George Carlin said, the table is tilted and the game is rigged. So nobody at the table cares so long as they're at the table. But we're not at the table.
They're not interested in your vote. If you want to have a say, you're going to have to put a lot of money in the pot.
We're all owned, is basically George Carlin's point was. We're all owned. The politicians are owned by these wealthy corporations, and we are owned by them as well because we're indoctrinated by them. And so I brought that up in the sermon in relation to Lazarus and the rich man. Because I said, the head of Viacom would step over me if I was face down in the gutter in front of his house or his business.
But you would do the same for him if you were in the gutter.
Right. Because I don't care. It's like I've talked about before. I train with a guy who's the head of a major food franchise. He's the president of the company. He started the company, but he doesn't want anybody to know that
now
at the
you
gym
mentioned it in 2 episodes. Somebody's going to do the research and figure this out.
Right. But the point is he just wants to be a regular guy.
Yeah.
And I respect that about him. And vice versa. I have people that train there that basically other people cover their gym fees because they're not in a good spot. But this is for their sobriety, or they got a divorce, or they're suicidal, or whatever it might be. They just need it. Yeah. And yet when they're together, those two people are rolling together. They're just people. They're just human beings. And
which is beautiful.
It is beautiful. But the point that I brought up in the sermon in relation to the law then is, now that you are aware of these facts about the media companies and indoctrination and the politicians and your part in society, it doesn't mean you don't vote. It doesn't mean that you don't watch TV or never go out of your house again and just move to the Arctic Circle and live off the grid. It means then that you have a proper view of what the media is there for and what they're trying to accomplish. And that if you can at least recognize, okay, they have a viewpoint, they're trying to sell you something. This is lobbying. They're lobbying you for your vote or your purchase, your purchasing dollars. Then you can step back and say, okay, these people behave like gods, but they're not gods.
Well, because really, ultimately, what they need most of all is attention. They need your undivided attention.
And they want to feed you misinformation. They want to feed you advertising. They want to feed you these promises, sugar-coated lies. And I just
hold you captive to them.
To hold you captive. And I said, in Christ, we're fed his body and blood, which sets us free to take a step out of this and say, okay, but I'm in the world, yes, but I'm not of this. This is not me. This is not the table that I want to be sitting at.
Right.
But I think to not draw that out now as a church, to get back to the point, to not draw that out as a church and not point at it when it's so blatant, so explicit, like we were talking about with politicians marching in the protests, but then threatening to arrest beauty shop owners for cutting hair.
Right.
Like if you don't point at that, in my opinion, if you don't point at that as a church and say, she has clay feet, and we need to be cautious then as Christians, we have to be cautious about how we listen to bureaucrats or the media.
So like Daniel to Nebuchadnezzar,
yes,
then.
100%. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think now more than ever, we have an opportunity to be a prophetic voice in society, in a biblical understanding of prophetic voice.
Well, and one of the things that I think we have to say is there's no promise that this, American democratic experiment, which is the first time it's ever been tried, is going to succeed, even with the amendments and the ways we've tried to fix it.
Right.
Right. And to put your trust or hope there, and these kingdoms come and go, and it might last a long time. It might last a millennium, but maybe not.
Yeah. But I was talking about with the older pastors, the boomers, they're concerned about Corona, and they should be. They're in their 60s and 70s.
It's a real threat.
But then the guys in their late 20s, early 30s, with their just starting families, they're concerned about the racial tension and the Second Amendment stuff and the breakdown of these big cities and what's going to happen with the defunding the police and so forth. Different sets of priorities, but they're different generations. And the boomers, like I said, they went through the race riots and the protests and civil rights and stuff. They went through all that. They were in college and coming out of seminary when that stuff was happening.
In a sense, they're over it.
Yeah.
Or at least they think we're over it.
Yeah, they've got that attitude of like, been there, done that. Don't worry, this will play itself out. But then the younger people, of course, are the opposite. And like I said then, just be understanding that you had to go through this and now it's their time to go through this. And it's just, no one ever thinks that when they're born, it's like I think about people born in the late 1800s. Did they really think that they're going to be in their 60s when the Depression hit? No, of course not. Did they think there was ever going to be a world war, let alone two? No, of course not. So when the 60s popped off, how many people that were just in high school in, let's say, 1962, 63, thought by the end of the decade, this was going to be the world, right? Nobody, other than McNamara and a few people at the Pentagon.
Right.
But nonetheless, you look at our generation then and the amount of leisure and privilege that we've all enjoyed in this country for a relatively long time when you think about it. And you and I can think back to the early 90s when we were in college. I was going to say,
but we can remember back to the before the end of the Cold War.
Yeah, exactly.
We were still seeing videos of like duck and cover.
Yeah.
Preparing for like missile attack.
Yeah.
You're like, I can't even. I imagine my children can't even fathom the idea of like people are going to send missiles and attack us. We're like impenetrable here in the middle of the Midwest. Well, no, actually,
my teachers. So my elementary school teachers, they were all Vietnam era adults. So they served in Vietnam. They dodged the draft. They marched for civil rights. They were arrested. They were tear gassed. These are the people who taught me not to be a racist and to not trust the government or institutions. Ironically, in public school, that's what I learned. Because they lived through it. And so for them, they became teachers to reform the system, so to speak. And they introduced me to stuff that today, if you look back, you're like, wow, I had an amazing public school education, actually. Like I learned a lot
Well, and I think it's almost like a dialectic. We move back and forth.
Yeah.
And that it shifts and we're kind of shifting back,
Yeah, my kids' education is ridiculously bad. It's amazing.
Well, and maybe what happens is we become complacent.
100%.
And then we don't, there's no continual, critique and reform. I'm not saying everything has to be reformed, but sometimes the reform is to go back to what was.
Well, we talked about this yesterday. It's never being satisfied with good enough.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And recognizing that good enough means I'm just meh, whatever.
It means
it's
dead,
just whatever.
Really.
Yeah, basically. And I actually said this on the podcast this past Saturday, the Warrior Priest podcast, is what I realized talking with a friend of mine on Saturday is my generation got complacent. We got complacent because I was raised with things like brown eyes, blue eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And the Stanford Prison Experiment. I was raised by Sesame Street back when it was actually good. That you have paint, I have brushes, he has paper. Let's cooperate and make art. I grew up with this stuff. And
Mr. Rogers,
exactly. Mr. Rogers, the electric company. And my dad went to Vietnam, essentially a cultural racist because he grew up in north central Minnesota, learned about life in Vietnam twice, came back, raised me a certain way then to not be a racist or a bigot, raised me to think for myself and question everything and help other people. And I saw that with Gen Xers when we were in college. We were very DIY and very activistic locally. I had a lot of friends in AmeriCorps, for example. And what's the one where you build homes? Homes for the...
Habitat for
Humanity. Thank you. We just did that after college. It was just what you did. You just did it. All of my friends, every friend in my peer group at college, when we graduated, we all went to work in group homes with mentally handicapped people. All of us. It was just we all just decided, if we're going to do something worthwhile with not the degree that we got, let's do this.
Wow.
But like I said to my friend who's a millennial, I said, talking with him about Chappelle, I realized, I hadn't realized how complacent my generation has been then in relation to racism because...
Specifically, yeah.
Yeah, because for me, it was never an issue. It just wasn't an issue. It was stupid. Nobody I knew, and even the people at college who were overtly racists, it was just kind of that one person over there is a racist.
Yeah. Well, I went to high school, I think when I graduated, I think we were up to about 1,400. And I think there was one black family, for example.
Yeah.
So, it just wasn't, we weren't exposed to it. I was never going to even listen to hip hop, for example.
Right.
And at that point, because it wasn't really a mainstream genre. Maybe I listened to Beastie Boys or something, but that's, those are white guys. Anyway. Yeah. There was no exposure. And so it wasn't
I didn't even meet a Jewish person until college.
Well, I did have a friend that was that way, but
he was that way.
He was that way. Well, but nominally Jew. Actually, a couple. But just nominally Jew. So I'm not really exposed to actual, religious Judaism. But regardless, it was you're not exposed to it. You don't have it, but you're also not prepared to deal with it when you're faced with what happens when when you're the minority, for example.
Well, I think it's easy to get complacent, to point back at my finger at myself, because I'm surrounded by people of different creeds and skin colors and genders all the time.
Yeah.
So when someone's like, "You're a racist," I'm like, "Wait, I am? When did this happen? Why didn't anybody tell me amongst all of my different friends who are all different colors from different countries? Why didn't someone tell me?"
Well, I think that's the point, though, isn't it? As soon as you start distinguishing, making, and even I use that word minority. That is an inherently racist term. You're saying that there are majorities and minorities. You're saying there is a distinction. Well, of course there's distinction. Well, who's making those distinctions?
Right.
And on what basis? You can have class distinctions, right? Economic ones. You can have obviously racial ones. You could have religious ones. You could be a religious minority.
Right.
And all of those, I think that's the thing with racism in particular, is that it, it's just a particular kind of tribalism. We've talked a lot about tribalism.
Yeah.
Especially in a religious way. And the challenges with that tribal instinct, well, that is inherent to us.
It is. No, when I was in Guatemala
Cain and Abel, isn't it?
It's Cain and Abel, exactly. I have friends from Africa. They do it in Africa. I've had friends from India. You want to talk about racists? Go to India.
Well, they have the caste system too.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. This goes back thousands of years. And I was in a conversation about a month ago with my friend Brittany about this, because She's like, yeah, what do you think about people who say that I don't see color? I'm like, I see your color. I think you're beautiful. I think that's the kind of the point. Like, God made you that color. Like, God used the whole palette.
But I mean, there's almost a danger in even saying that now.
Yeah.
You're like, well, but now you're pointing out something that's distinct. And
I am, as a Christian, I am, because she's my Christian sister. So I'm like, yeah, you're black. I think you're beautiful because God used like when I was in art school and someone was essentially just being intellectually lazy, they'd use 13 colors, shades of white on a painting.
Yeah, we talked about that.
Well, it's a statement about X, Y, and Z, right? And you're like, no, I saw you in the lab last night at 2 a.m. This is a Hail Mary pass here. Versus somebody who understands how to use color and light and composition. So anyways, we love you and we thank you for everything, and we will see you for a brand new set of episodes next week. Peace.